I hope it works properly. So thank you for our discussion on disability and eugenics. And I should like to start by saying thank you to the organisers of the Think Human Festival, Gary and Laura in particular, who from the very beginning believed that there is scope within the festival to have a conversation about eugenics and to reach out and bring this conversation in connection to other important topics that we are interested in. And today is going to be about disability, and on Saturday is going to be about racism. And to have the exhibition here is particularly rewarding to me as the curator, as obviously this is my home institution. It is always very pleasant to put something on your own turf. And to see my colleagues and my students here, it's so rewarding. So thank you to all for coming. The way we're going to do this, it's very simple. I'm going to say a few words, not too many because I don't want the spotlight to be on me, but rather on my guests. So I'm going to say something for about 5 to 10 minutes maximum, then my first guest, and then my second guest. And then we'll have time to collect some questions or comments. And I know some of the students need to be going to the 1 o'clock lecture. And so we'll try to finish, so 5 to 1 o'clock. That's okay. So eugenics as a self-styled theory, scientific theory of human betterment in plant breeding. The main purpose of eugenics was basically, as some of you know, was to improve the human quality, of the genetic quality of the population, through the control of reproduction and social selection. And in some extreme forms, basically, it tried to prevent those who were deemed unfit or feeble-minded or subnormal or asocial to reproduce. And eugenicists sought to prevent them from having children. Now, the individual who was stigmatized as eugenically unfit was an individual whose purpose in life was called into question. In the name of the common good, it was deemed necessary to weed out these individuals, or, if that wasn't possible, to really exclude them from the normal rhythm of society. Now, he or she, and in most cases was a she, women were particularly targeted by eugenicists. They were continuously marginalized and mistreated, and we'll hear more about it later. And their alleged inferiority was repeatedly reinforced through racist legislation, state-sanctioned policies of sterilization, discrimination, institutionalization, and segregation. And in some countries, such as Nazi Germany, as you know, their lives were deemed entirely unworthy of living, and they were murdered during the T4 euthanasia program. Now, disability loomed very large in this conversation about eugenics. From the very beginning, eugenicists were very concerned that what they call people, feeble-minded people with what we call today intellectual and developmental disabilities, were on the rise. So modern societies are under threat from people with mental health problems. And you can see this in every country, irrespective of the fact whether they had a very strong or very weak eugenic movement. That obsession they had with disability really echoes widely across the world. And they really just created a language, a terminology, and a practice to deal with people they deemed mentally inferior or mentally defective. Their bodies were eugenically marked. They were considered to have a tainted heredity, and they were labelled in such an offensive way. And an entire arsenal of words, now still in use, were created at the time by psychologists and psychiatrists to deal with these people. Labels such as I mentioned, feeble-minded, but also idiot, or moron, or imbecile, or mentally defective. All of these were words created and terms applied then to people in order to deal with them. So, whilst the life of an individual deemed hereditarily superior was prioritized, a host of measurements and tests were carried out to demonstrate that others who seem to have a different form of humanity, a less able humanity, need to be treated. They were institutionalized, they were put in special schools, they were put in colonies. There is legislation dealing with that. And in this country, as some of you know, we had the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913 applied in 1914. So the temptation, in short, was, as it is to this day, was to sort out a social problem by using a biological argument. So they were believed that, if you put away people's mental problems, you could solve crime, or you could solve our prostitution, or you could solve our poverty. And this was extremely dangerous. It continues to be very dangerous to this day. And basically assume that someone's type of behavior, or someone's is characterized by an innate tendency to poverty or promiscuity. And eugenicists are very good at highlighting that social context and then sort of terminating the possibility of anyone to come through, because the ultimate argument that was employed against them was the biological argument. Now, it is worth paying attention to the debate scientists have, and it's good to look at what anthropologists or geneticists or biologists have to say about eugenics, but ultimately, and this is something I've been trying with the exhibition, we need to understand the context of the cultures within which these arguments circulate. So we need to push this conversation away from just the specialized journals or the books written about the topic to understand how that worked in various contexts. That's one strategy. And the other strategy, of course, as we'll hear soon, is to actually bring forward the voice of those who lived with eugenics, continue to be affected by types of eugenic thinking or eugenic policies. We need to have a conversation that cuts across generations to open new fields of debate. And we need to have that voice out loud and clear. And that's not an academic conversation. We need those voices to inform policy rather than we have policy informing the voices of dissent or of criticism. Disturbingly, as some of you know again, eugenics did not disappear after 1945, and the link between mental disability, social unfitness, poverty remained unchallenged in many countries after 1945. And of course, we can agree on that, the growing impact of environmentalism, of the cultural constructivism, recentered the language of eugenics. And this is true, but when it comes to certain categories of people of color, or women of color, people with disability, the eugenic language remains quite central. So that dehumanization of people affected by the eugenic rhetoric continued after 1945. And in some cases actually became even more pronounced in the 1960s and 70s. People working on sterilization in the United States will tell you that actually the real problematic cases are rather 60s and 70s during the civil rights movement rather than 1910s and 1920s. So, and to give you another example, if you look at the European context, the sterilization of women with learning disabilities was legal in Spain and other European countries until 3 years ago. 3 years ago, women with learning disabilities were sterilized in the European Union. So in 2024, today, we could see how eugenics remain attached to cultural and political processes. And now in this country, of course, as some of you be aware, we have this big debate about the Down Act and the amendment to it. In other parts of the world, we look at Canada, we have the discussion on MAID. So we could see how eugenic remains well anchored. In some cases, you may say, remains embedded in social policies, remains embedded in patterns of dealing with people who are different. So eugenics was truly global, and maybe we'll never know the true impact. What I can say, having studied and researched it for so many years, is that it cuts so deep into the texture of our modern societies. It cuts so deep into the texture of our own lives. And that's very difficult to accept. But doesn't mean that we don't have to stand up and take a very honest and forward-looking approach to it. Because we need to engage, I argue, with these legacies. We need to reclaim the spaces eugenics has occupied for so long, whether we're talking about an institution, an academic space, and we see this with major universities in this country and across the world. We see this with organizations which need to reckon with their past. We see this with major hospitals. Now we can look at their history. Famous asylums that actually institutionalized, kept people away and locked away. So all of these sort of things we need to reclaim back. We need to take it forward. And to do that today, I'm going to focus on two directions of how this discussion about disability could work. One is about people with Down syndrome and what someone, I suppose, not necessarily because it's ignorant or because it's ill-intended, would immediately identify as a disability. Because there is a lot of ignorance around it, and very few people actually understand what it means to live and to live with disability and to have someone with disability living with you. And that is one direction, and the other one is a bit more complicated in many ways because it's rarely discussed in this situation, but I wanted to provoke and challenge you, which is about how a very abusive reproductive procedure like sterilization could change the life of a human being, a woman, to push it into a way to create a disability context into which the person feels that it's basically there's very little air left to breathe there, and that story has to come out. So in order to do this, I thought it would be interesting because Nikki Fox, who was supposed to introduce this, the BBC correspondent for disability, couldn't be here today, so then I took her role as a guide. But then we had another guest coming in. So the first one is Ramandeep Kaur. He is a campaigner, an activist, committed in many ways to ensure that people with learning disability are supported and loved. And she's got three amazing boys, fantastic boys. But one of them, Harry, has Down. And Rami, as she's known to her friends, Rami has been living with the constant struggle and effort she puts up every day to make life better for Harry and to make people understand that Harry is no way different than other kids or young men, and he deserves to be treated accordingly. So she works very hard, publicly and privately. She has got a degree from the University of Birmingham, and she's using some of her knowledge of disability to help charity organizations with their policy work. So that's her perspective. And then finally we have Terry Marttinen, who is a survivor, as I pointed out. You probably understood that I'm alluding to her by now. Is a survivor of eugenic reproductive abuse. And she's going to speak out today about her experience. And she's also part of this very important effort that's being led by the Ontario Senator, Yvonne Boyer, who's now collecting testimonies from Indigenous women who are sterilised in Canada, and they're creating a public debate in Canada about the stories they need to tell about sterilisation. So Terry Lee is going to look at stuff through an intersectional lens at what disability and reproduction and sterilisation means to us. Okay, thank you, and without further ado, Rami, the floor is yours.
Thanks for inviting me to come and talk today, Marius. I really appreciate that. So I'm here to talk about my lived experience of being a parent to a young person who lives with learning disabilities, and I just want to touch on some of the legacies of eugenics and how they still impact my son and children like him through educational, financial, health and welfare policies. But before I start, I will say I'm not disabled. I'm not here to speak over anyone or for anyone. These are my experiences that I lived through my son. And actually, I feel empowered to stand up and talk about him and about the issues he faces, because there's a wonderful academic and scholar out there called Ava Kitte, and she's a mother to a severely disabled young woman, and she actually said that parents like me, we have a moral duty to challenge those who may go on to influence policy that could have a detrimental impact on our children. So that's where my positioning is today. So as Marius said, I'm a parent, I'm an activist, I'm a campaigner, I do research for charities to help them with their social policies. So I have 3 sons, 3 teenagers, and my middle son Harry, he has Down syndrome, something we didn't find out about until he was born, so he was diagnosed postnatally. Now when Harry was born, the normal rhythm of life in a Punjabi household like mine is you celebrate, and you celebrate hard. So when my eldest son was born, we partied, we drank, we gave sweets to everyone, and everybody knew about him. But when Harry came along, things were quite different. People didn't bother coming to see him. There were no sweets given out. Nobody drank. There was a real sombre kind of mood. And amongst my community, we felt really stigmatised, and it was really, really isolating. And some people were actively hostile. So when he was little, I remember sitting in a room and somebody saying to me, "Oh, it's such a shame. I think you've been cursed." And I was kind of thinking, well, no, I don't think I have. I said, well, you were an unmarried mother, so maybe that's why you've got a disabled child. Yeah, I did break a lot of rules. But that feeling of stigma didn't leave me, and I think it stayed with us for a very, very long time. I think things are changing in my community, but having spoken to a lot of other families over the years, I've kind of realised that it's a universal concept. There is huge stigma attached to disability. And I was made to feel like a failure. I was a failure as a parent, and I was made to feel like a failure because I brought this person into the world who wasn't going to contribute anything, immediately seen as unproductive. So all these assumptions and these biases that people carry, I mean, where do they come from? We live in a society where disability is still not considered an essential part of our humanity. So my son, born with his learning disabilities, means that he needs a huge amount of support. And that's fine, we give him that support, but I have to fight for it. But I often question myself and think, well, actually there's things in my life that I need support with, but I don't have to fight. It's just readily given to me. So why do we treat these things so differently? And I think it is because there is a legacy of eugenic thinking, and it makes people think that way about disabled people, unfit minds and unfit bodies. Now, my son under the Nazis would have been classed as unworthy of life, and the eugenicists would have called him feeble-minded, completely unproductive. But we have to remember that disability can impact any one of us at any moment in our lives. So we have to think human, and we have to do our very best to remove that stigma. But there are so many policies that exist around us today which continue to stigmatise people. They're really not helpful. So I'm just going to talk about a few experiences I've had with my son. So if we start with education, there are really, really strong legal frameworks in place for children like my son to be in education, to have the right to be educated. But this wasn't always the case for young people with learning disabilities. At one stage, children were separated into 2 quite distinct categories. You have those who were found to be educable, so yeah, we can educate you, and then there were the ineducable children. That would have been my son. So the labelling has already started, and then the labelling developed, and my son would have been called educationally subnormal. So that was in the 60s. So you can see the language around the way we treat people with learning disabilities is so dehumanising. My other children are not spoken of as subnormal, ineducable. So why is Harry treated that way? we really have to do better when we think about the language we use. But every year, thousands of families of disabled children have to fight to get support. They have to fight even to get a school place for their kids. There are thousands of children up and down the country who just don't have a school place at the minute, and that's because they've got special educational needs and disabilities. And it feels really unfair because my other two boys, I didn't have to fight to get them a school place. I just filled in a form and I was told by the council, right, they start 6th of September, off you go. With Harry, it was a battle from the very first day, even to the point where I wasn't allowed to choose the school he wanted to go to. And I think this is the problem that we have with education. It needs to be inclusive, and we're really failing at doing that. We need to stop seeing disabled children as problems to be fixed. I know that with good training in schools, and if we train our teachers properly, and we have a really good understanding of how to support children with disabilities, that they can be included in mainstream schools. And I also think if we do that, we will reduce the stigma around disability, because it'll be normal to see somebody in a wheelchair in your classroom, or somebody who wears hearing aids, or somebody who maybe needs to use a communication aid. Yes, I understand that there's funding structures. We always talk about funding, but in the long term, the benefits are to society, and they far outweigh any financial strain. My local council, so I'm from bankrupt Birmingham, as I like to call it, we made headlines up and down the country because, you know, our financial state is absolutely awful. And they have gone ahead and made over £51 million of cuts from children's services. Now those cuts will impact my disabled son directly because they're going to take away his home to school transport. I've been told there's nothing that they can do, there's nothing I can do. They're trying their best to support disabled teenagers, but the truth is it comes down to cost cutting. He is seen as a financial burden. And there's a contradiction there, because on the one hand, the local authority by law is expected to provide education for youngsters in the age group of 16 to 18. But then they create a policy which removes his access to the transport, which will get him to the school. For some reason, the council don't seem to understand that. And that's not where the contradictions end. If we look at financial support, we're in a cost of living crisis, and all the evidence suggests that if you are disabled, it costs you more to live your lives. So we thought, oh, we're okay. Harry's got a child trust fund. He's got £8,000 in there, and in a year's time, he can go to the bank and he can take his money out and he can spend it on whatever he wants. He can put it towards sporting activities, all the things that he loves to do, and it would take some of the pressure off us as a family. So it was a great idea. Child trust funds were set up by the Labour government in 2002. I was really excited, and I went out and I set them up for all three of my sons, ploughed money into them. My eldest last year went off to the bank, withdrew £8,000. I've not seen him since. But Harry won't be able to do that. We're told by the government that I will have to go to the Court of Protection. Now that's not fair. Harry has every right to be able to access his money. It's not the taxpayers' money. This is money that I've put into an account. It's money that his dad's put in, grandparents, family members. But no, he has a learning disability. He has to go through the Court of Protection. It's an incredibly long-winded process. I've lost count of how many forms you have to fill in, and it's expensive. So again, it's that whole thing about you're disabled, it costs you more to do what everybody else takes for granted. And then these eugenic legacies, they persist in our healthcare system. My earliest example of sitting down with someone and realising that they didn't think my son was worthy of support was going to an ENT clinic with him. So when he was born, he was profoundly deaf and he wore hearing aids. And you can imagine a little child running around, not really sure what's happening in the world around him, and mum's plugging in these hearing aids. And of course, he would lose them. Every other day I would find a hearing aid lost. So I spent about 2 years running in and out of my local ENT department. And then eventually somebody suggested there is a solution, he could have a surgical intervention. So I recall going into the appointment and sitting in front of the consultant and saying, right, somebody told me we can have a surgical intervention and it will help Harry, he won't have to wear hearing aids. And the consultant simply looked at me and said, your son has Down syndrome. Does it really matter if he can hear? I think that's one of the hardest moments that I've had with my son, to be told, well, does it really matter if he can hear? Thankfully, I went away and found a magnificent surgeon in Manchester who within 8 weeks had operated on my son. We got rid of those blooming hearing aids and he was a transformed child. I think things are changing, but I know that even my eldest son is in medical school, and I know that even he has said to me, we don't really have any modules about learning disabilities or how to treat people. So I'm not sure how we change the system there. Now I've noticed improvements, but I think that's more down to me being a warrior mum and actually fighting everybody that I come across. I'm not normally that harsh, but... So yeah, there are changes that are happening. However, we saw during COVID-19 and the pandemic how poorly disabled people were treated. They were unnecessarily had DNA CPRs, so they do not resuscitate. They were slapped on them in the hospitals. Doctors were actively making decisions not to put disabled people on ventilators. We had to actually fight to get the vaccine for my son when it came out, even though he is immunocompromised. And we had to go through a really lengthy battle in order to support him. We felt people were really, really let down by the medical profession and also by the government. And life expectancy remains much lower for him than that of the general population. And in fact, the most recent research that's come out about people from minority ethnic backgrounds suggests that the life expectancy of a person with severe learning disabilities from the group that my son belongs to is just 34 years. My son's 17, so in fact, he's probably lived half his life already. But even when we think about accessing other services, such as adult social care, everything is dehumanising. You have to fill in endless forms. So my son's disability form, I think I filled in 50 pages. It's just unnecessary. We spend our lives trawling through paperwork. And you have to repeat your story every year. So every year I get asked, has anything changed? Does he still need support going to the bathroom? Can he shower himself? And I feel like saying, you know that pesky little chromosome that he's got? It's not going anywhere, it's still there. So please stop sending me the bloody forms. But there are more horror stories, and we hear about it all the time in care homes and in residential settings, and that's never far from my mind. So it's been a decade since Winterbourne View, and that was when we saw learning disabled and autistic young people subjected to the most horrific abuse. There were court cases and people went to prison. So there were successful prosecutions, but the sad truth is we hear about it time and time again. and there never seems to be a national outcry. There's also the institutional abuse of people who are in assessment and treatment units. So these are people who have learning disabilities and are autistic and may be having a mental crisis. The government has promised to reduce the number of people who are currently being held in these units, but nothing's happened. We keep getting told this year. There are currently over 2,000 people who are being held under the Mental Health Act. There should be a commitment to supporting people to live in the communities where they belong, where they feel at home. But the government is refusing to commit to this. The academic Simon Jarrett wrote in his quite incredible book, Those They Called Idiots, he wrote about a time when disabled people, and particularly those with learning disabilities, were part of their communities. They were doing little jobs, they were welcomed into people's homes, fed, watered, treated as human. But I think we're moving back to institutionalising people by putting them in these mental health assessment units, rather than providing them with homes to live in. In fact, today there's a protest that's happening in Wales, and it's calling for the Welsh Government to take action around the incarceration of people in these mental health units. They're asking for homes, not hospitals, and they're using the slogan, stolen lives. And there's constant stories about people dying avoidable deaths. And we keep getting told lessons have been learnt. But have they? Just this week there's another inquest. A gentleman called Marcus, he was 57 years old, had Down syndrome, was in a supported living setting, and he died because he was taking part in an activity where everybody knew he was not to be left with any food, and he died by choking on a conker because he thought it was a piece of food. So the inquest has started this week, and if you do get a chance to have a look at it, it's quite harrowing. But even the language we use around disability is eugenic in its intent. We have a welfare state which is meant to support disabled people, but it's so often seen as encouraging the work shy and creating scroungers. Yet the reality is that being disabled is expensive. There's so many additional costs, so it's only fair that as taxpayers we support people. And on that note, we should be reflecting about what happened in Nazi Germany. As Marius just said, they took eugenics to the extreme. It was unthinkable, the Holocaust and Action T4. German propaganda, it insisted that disabled people were a burden on the state. They would release posters and films on a regular basis, declaring that the state couldn't carry this burden. And it led to the murder of hundreds and thousands of adults and disabled children. Hopefully, we will never ever experience that again. But that kind of propaganda still exists, even though it may not be as explicit as it was. Recently there was an article in the Telegraph newspaper, and they directed readers to an online calculator where you could work out how much it was costing the taxpayer to support people on benefits. So that would have been the question, how much is it costing you to support a disabled person? Surely we've moved beyond that. And before I finish, I just want to briefly talk about models of disability. So the disabled people's movement developed the idea about the social model of disabilities and how it's actually society that disables them. And then they're shifting away from what was the medical model, which said that your actual impairment is your disabling factor. Now, none of those actually, I think, work for my son, because he needs something a little bit more than an accessible building or a ramp. His learning disability is the most disabling aspect of his life. But I think we need to think of a new model, and for me we need to think about a human model, where we actually just see the human in front of us, and then we see each person's individual needs, their aspirations, their hopes, their challenges, and that we support them. And we celebrate all the great things that people can achieve, but we also don't forget those that can't, and also don't make them invisible. So Harry's life chances should be equal to those of his two brothers. His human rights should never be an afterthought. And as a society, we need to remember that we are all human, and my son has every right to be here and to live a good life in the community he belongs. So if we do think human, and all these challenges are weaved into the solutions of everyday policy, then nobody's left behind. We'll stop othering groups of people, and we can actually create a society which includes everyone. And I think that surely this is the legacy that we should be leaving behind.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move the last speaker, and then we're going to collect some comments and questions. Okay, Terry.
Okay, I'm glad you can hear me. I'm a student of Marius's. I'm in my second year. Oh, there's Jane. Hi, Jane. I want to start by saying I contacted Senator Boyer. She's a Canadian senator, opposed to an Ontario senator, but she led a probe into contemporary sterilization of Indigenous and other marginalized women in Canada. And I felt compelled to tell her my story after I was looking at the stories of women in her probe for my PhD research. So I called her up, and she was gracious and had a Zoom call with me. And I recently shared my story for her web project that is collecting the stories of women, and that will be up shortly as well. And I did that to breach taboos on talking about reproductive violence. There's a lot of silence about talking about gender and reproductive violence. And I appreciate this public forum to do that, even though admittedly for me it's very difficult. I suggest that sterilization abuse intersects with racial, disability, class, and other minoritized identities and is marked by negative health effects. And researchers and governments alike must consider sterilization abuse among socially vulnerable women as a factor of disablement perpetuating deep poverty. Karen Stote, a Canadian historian, argues in An Act of Genocide, Colonialism and Sterilization of Aboriginal Women that sterilization rates, which are elevated among them, are directly related to government funding priorities. Coercive and forced sterilization is linked to other colonial policies such as adoption and foster care, resulting in a loss of children that reduces federal obligations for Indigenous peoples, which is really parallel on issues we're seeing that we're facing. Yet, reproductive violence's role in the development of disability among Indigenous people and non-Indigenous marginalized people, nurturing dependence on government disability benefits and services really remains underappreciated. Now, cultural codes endorse suppression of gender violence and its role in undermining health and personal autonomy, and a lack of trust fostered by reproductive violence adds to the scarcity, I think, of critical research on the embodied impact of evolving eugenic policies and practices. Is that razor too much? It's not making sense. Yeah. I didn't disclose my sterilization, which happened during an abortion procedure when I was 22 years old, to my mother until last year. Due to ultra-conservative family values, I kept the traumatizing event a secret from the people closest to me first because of earlier ostracism by my religious community. and also because abortion was criminalized in Canada until 1988. An anti-abortion clinic, Henry Morgenthaler was attacked, and in an attempted murder, and in 1992 his clinic was firebombed in Toronto. So I internalized medical abuse as my fault, which I think in a process of self-stigmatization. Now, to explain, I asked about being sterilized during an abortion for a second unplanned pregnancy due to failed contraception because of earlier family, community, and public reactions. Compounding the trauma of early adverse life events, the father of my child was born in an Indian reservation. That's a government, federal government term for First Nation communities, and was removed by the state as a child. He had committed suicide after developing psychosis when our daughter was 3. Despite my history of depression as a teenager, nurtured by rigid religious norms and the trauma around suicide known by primary physicians, I was assured I would be able to have children again after a two-hole reversal procedure. At a mandatory medical assessment for approval of abortion on health grounds, and a major conflict of interest, I think, anyway, my former partner's psychiatrist performed the exam. He didn't discuss my personal or medical history when I identified myself, which I did upon meeting him, and there was no mention of the sterilization procedure. I'm still coming to terms today with the fact that while abortion is criminal unless a pregnancy threatened my health or life, that was sanctioned, I was declared unfit to carry a fetus to term, yet my sterilization was a non-issue. My case didn't meet the bar for informed consent in interaction with the medical system. I've learned that through my research process. And this is validated by Senator Boyer in our discussion, followed by lawyer Alyssa Lombard, who filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of sterilized Indigenous women in Western Canada. I wasn't told by male physicians that it was extremely rare to sterilize young women in a vulnerable state, especially during an abortion. Furthermore, that tubal ligation was permanent. I would never have consented. I can tell you I would never have consented because of entrenched family values, which were pro-natalist. My experience of social welfare and disability benefit systems that you have to deal with, which I know from experience is extremely painful and exhausting, intensified the imposed harm of having the right to have children taken away from me. Welfare rules restricted relationships through penalizing government policy aimed at reducing welfare dependency. Euphemistically coined spouse in the house rules, they clawed back benefits or terminated them among those living with a partner who got married. And this was both for the family benefits, which I was on earlier, followed by disability benefits after developing chronic illness. Senator Boyer's inquiry confirms that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women are overrepresented by coercive and forced sterilization in a racist medical system intersecting with other forms of institutionalized intergenerational violence, and that has had long-term health impacts. The inquiry into ongoing eugenic sterilization in Canada demonstrates more attention needs to be paid to the role of reproductive violence in creating disability among marginalized women like myself from an intersectional lens. My experience corroborates that traumas affiliated with colonialism over time and space are disabling women in Canada. More importantly, ethical medical care and material support, as well as confronting harms, which is why I'm doing this today, can help to heal body and minds. So Senator Boyer, in really good news, introduced a private member's bill to criminalize coercive and forced sterilization, which was called for by the Indigenous women survivors. This is hoped to be enacted by the end of the year. I unreservedly support the bill, which can lead up to conviction of 14 years in prison for physicians found sterilizing women unethically. Currently, there are 5 class action lawsuits filed in provinces across Canada for eugenic sterilizations. I'm not a participant, but I'm no longer isolated and forced to absorb unethical medical practices and self-stigmatization. Now, there's a lot more to be accomplished confronting the legacy of eugenics. We have euthanasia being rolled out to disabled people that are not at the end of life. We call it Track 2 Made in Canada, and UK and other countries are considering doing the same. Euthanasia is being dubbed as a cost-effective form of healthcare with little regard for the complex inequities like I'm experienced, uncovered in official probes with very few safeguards. The current federal government has endorsed euthanasia as a choice in a market basket of medical services, promoting autonomy without consulting disabled people, especially those experiencing poverty and related hunger, homelessness, and so on. I fail personally to understand how equal access to death, contextualized by a lack of equitable medical and social care during my life, promotes human dignity. I can tell you it does not, nor does it promote self-determination systematically denied to me over my life and Indigenous and other marginalized women who are disability and or Indigenous rights holders. Now, to close, just on a personal note, I've lived with chronic illness in all its manifestations over my life, and it's never prevented me from doing anything. It's changed how I've done things, but it's never prevented me from doing anything. My life has been meaningful. When I was sick, I had the right to be supported, and I was constantly demoralized, like you experienced a demoralizing process. And with attacks, on my well-being, sometimes overt. Disabled activists were the first to sound the alarm that legal suicide has been used by people on benefits in Canada to escape growing legislative poverty over the COVID-19 pandemic, which, like medical discrimination, targeting reproduction, has been traumatizing for all those affected. As a final comment, the expansion of euthanasia for a sole diagnosis of mental illness, such as psychosis experienced by my former partner, has been stayed until March 2027. I wrote a letter against the expansion to a special committee that was formed because it created so much public controversy. And the debates are ongoing, which is warranting more forums like this and partnerships between academics, disabled people, and justice movements. To deal with the legacy of eugenics that is still ongoing as a way forward. Thank you.